Hey, and welcome to this week's coaching video for those of you who are going to be facilitating an off-campus small group through Dayspring's ministry. Glad you're here, glad you're watching. This video is designed to help you get ready to lead the discussion for your small group. So if you're the one facilitating that discussion this week, go ahead and grab the discussion guide that we're going to be using and grab something to write with, because I'm going to talk you through it. We're just going to spend some time looking at it together. I'm going to give you some insights or thoughts that might be helpful as you get ready to facilitate the discussion this week, all right? So grab your handout and let's move through it together. Now, let me give you the big picture before we look at the individual components of this handout. This week's discussion is about faith. That's what you're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what it looks like to actually exercise faith. What does an active faith look like? Now, a couple of questions that you're going to consider along the way is not just what does faith look like, but also what are the things that help us practice our faith, and what are some things that get in the way of us practicing our faith. So those are some things that you'll think about along the way. Now, this particular discussion guide is going to flow very well with what you're going to be hearing on Sunday. In fact, you're going to be in the same exact part of the Bible, the very chapter of the Bible that the sermon will come from. So there'll be a lot of overlap, should be a lot of dovetailing together that should give you some good discussion points. All right, so let's look at the handout together as we talk about faith and what it looks like and what it looks like to practice it. Discussion point number one, this is what gets you back to the Sunday sermon, gets you back to any sermon notes that anyone took, and really gets the dialogue going. Now, obviously, we're going to be talking about faith in the Sunday service, looking at the life of Joseph, and this verse will kind of get you back on track there. Be careful as the discussion leader this week to take some good notes as part of the sermon. In particular, there are going to be some points made toward the tail end of the sermon. Be sure to write those down, because as you can see, your discussion guide says, did any of the major sermon points Sunday resonate with you? And if so, explain. As the leader, you need to be the one to make sure that you're writing some of those discussion points down, so that if anybody needs to recap them or review them, if people forgot to bring their sermon notes or didn't take any sermon notes, you can at least have those available for people. So that's how you're going to get started. That should get the conversation going and get everybody talking about what they learned and already know about faith. That brings you to discussion point number two. It says, in your own words, describe or define what faith is. And the key point there is in your own words. You know, certainly many groups are going to have some wise guy or some wise gal in it who are just going to quote Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, or at least allude to it. And obviously that's a good description and definition of faith. That's what the Bible tells us faith is. Being sure of what we have not seen and confident in what is to come. But the operative word here is in your own words. How would you describe faith? The way I've described it before, and it's not original to me, but I've talked about it in terms of being confident that God is who he says he is and that he'll do what he says he'll do. I mean, that's kind of been my working definition for faith for a long, long time. In fact, I taught a series on faith this past summer, and that's the definition that we worked off of, just being confident that God is who he says he is and that he'll do what he says he will do. That's how I would describe faith. You may have another way you describe it, but let people in your group, just in their own words, say, here's what I understand faith to be. It's important that you do help people realize that faith has more to do with what God has said than just what I will to be. That's not faith, that's presumption. Faith is always connected to a promise of God and a word God has spoken, and believing that. So that's really what faith is by definition. But look on discussion point number two. It says, what would you say is the one thing that keeps us from actually exercising faith? And your group may have to kind of chew on that for a moment before they come up with an answer. I'm guessing some people in your group are going to say doubt is the thing that keeps us from exercising faith, and certainly doubt contributes to a lack of faith. But here's really where you're going to focus on this discussion. So after people maybe give various answers, maybe you can throw this one out, that maybe the greatest detractor from actually exercising faith isn't so much doubt or uncertainty, but certainty, in the sense that we're maybe in a very comfortable spot in life, the kind of comfort that doesn't even require faith. So I think, as I kind of examine my own life, the seasons in which faith doesn't seem to show up in my life are the seasons where there's really nothing there that demands faith. So maybe it's not so much doubt that's the greatest enemy of faith as it is a life of comfort and a life where there is no uncertainty at all. And that's really what gets this lesson. That's really where this lesson lands. So when you talk about discussion point number 2, what's the greatest detractors of faith, after various answers have been given, maybe you can segue with that and say, well, what about when life is so comfortable and we really don't even have any uncertainties that life doesn't even seem to demand faith at the time? That's going to get you into the actual Bible portion that you're going to look at together, which is discussion point number 3. You're going to move to Hebrews chapter 11, the same chapter we studied on Sunday, but you're going to look specifically at the life of Abraham and the faith of Abraham. So what you're doing is, in this lesson, you're looking at the life of Abraham and how faith showed up in his life, what it looked like in his life. And what you're going to discover is that there were various forms of uncertainty that he faced, and in each instance, we see him exercising faith. So look at discussion point number 4. And what's interesting here about discussion point number 4 is this really is a little different than sometimes the handouts that you have, in this sense, that this one is not so much about discussion as it is just about learning and listening. Discussion point number 4. It almost reads like a lesson more than a discussion guide. But I'll speak to that in just a moment, okay? You've got 4 bullet points here. Look at them. It says, in this passage, we see various kinds of uncertainties that Abraham faced, which actually gave him a platform to exercise his faith. 4 different ones. Number 1, the uncertainty of change. Now, on each of these, you're going to go back and look back at the passage you just read in Hebrews 11. You're going to look at the uncertainty of change. You'll look at verse 8, where Abraham was told that he was going to have to uproot and move his family, and he was pretty settled and pretty comfortable. But God said, go. But God said, and I'm not going to tell you where. When you get there, then I'll tell you. So he had the uncertainty of change where he didn't know where God was leading him. The second one, the uncertainty of waiting. Look at verses 9 and 10, back at the same passage you just read from Hebrews 11. Basically there, Abraham knew that he was headed toward a promised land, but he didn't know when he or his descendants would get there. So that's the big question mark in the uncertainty. I'm going somewhere, and I don't even know when this promise is going to be fulfilled. The third uncertainty was the uncertainty of hardship. That's verses 11 and 12. Abraham had a promise from God, but he had no idea how God was going to bring this about. Because remember, Abraham was an old guy with an old wife, and they don't have any children. And God is saying that this promise has to do with your descendants. And of course, Abraham is going, well, how is that going to be? There's no way we're even going to have one child, let alone a whole nation of them. So Abraham really didn't know how this promise of God. And then the fourth one, he had the uncertainty of sacrifice, verses 17 through 19. This is about that dramatic moment, really a defining moment in Abraham's life where God had told him to sacrifice Isaac, his one and only son, in terms of the promise, the descendant. So here he's got this thing that God has told him to do, but he has no idea why he's supposed to do this. It doesn't make sense. And what you might do in preparation for this, go back into the book of Genesis, starting around chapter 11 or so, and read through a little bit of the life of Abraham and see some of these things unfolding if you're not that familiar with his life. But so discussion point number 4, basically what you have, again, it's almost like not so much dialogue here as much as it is you're just reading what's right there before you. Now, if you want to make it more of a dialogue kind of a thing, which is a great thing to do, what you might do after each of those bullet points is just throw out a question. Like, for example, on that first one, the uncertainty of change, where it talked about how Abraham was going somewhere, but he didn't know where that was. You might throw out a question after you read verse 8 and then read that statement. You might just say to the group something like, what do you think the hardest part of that would have been? Why do you think that particular thing he had to do? What do you think made that particularly difficult for him and so uncertain? And just let people talk about it. They might say, well, I think the hardest part would have been, actually uprooting or all those kind of things. You just throw that question out after each one, after you're talking about the hardship or the waiting or the sacrifice. Say, what do you think was the hardest part of this? I mean, what would have been the most difficult part of that uncertainty for Abraham? But what I would do, if you do that, really at this point, try and keep the focus on Abraham more than on you guys. In other words, don't say like, what do you think so hard for us when we don't know when? The reason I say that is because you're going to get to that. So at this point in the discussion, in the reading, you're just talking about Abraham and the uncertainties that he faced. And he had these all kinds, the change, the waiting, the hardship, the sacrifice. You're just moving through it and acquainting people with the story of Abraham, all right? That brings you to discussion point number 5. This is where you start applying it to your own life, and your group members start applying it to their own life. Look at discussion point number 5. It says, so it seems that God puts us in positions where the where, when, how, and why aren't clear. I mean, this is what he did with Abraham. So here's the question. Why do you suppose God does this to us? That's the question. God seems to orchestrate in our lives moments and even seasons where we're living with a question. When, where, how, why? We live with all of these uncertainties. The question is, why would God do that to us? And here's ultimately, at that point, you're just letting people answer it and talk it out. But here's ultimately where the discussion ought to go. God puts us in these positions and gives us uncertainties because uncertainty becomes the place and the platform whereby we can actually exercise faith. You see, this brings us all the way back up to discussion point number 2 when you were saying, what do you think the thing that really keeps us from practicing faith? This is why I said certainty, in the sense that life totally makes sense. Life is easy. All my questions are answered. In that moment, it's really hard to exercise faith. But when I have the uncertainties, that's where I can practice being certain of what I don't see or what I don't understand. God is actually giving us the opportunity to practice faith by allowing uncertainties into our lives. In fact, what you might do, look at Hebrews chapter 11 here. Look at verse 1 and look at verse 6. Verse 1, again, it gives us a beautiful definition of faith, a really good definition of faith. Verse 6, though, says that without faith, it's impossible to please God. So think about this. Could it be that God, in bringing these uncertain moments into our lives and these uncertain seasons where we are asking when, where, why, what, how, all those things, could it be that by creating those moments in our lives, God is actually giving us the greatest chance, the greatest platform, the greatest opportunity to practice the one thing that pleases Him in the sense of faith? Without faith, we will not please God. So God builds into our lives the opportunities to do that very thing. So that's really the answer to that question. Why do you suppose God does this for us? Really, it's for our own good. It's really for our own good. And here's a question you may throw out at the end of this. Think about it as it relates to Abraham. If Abraham didn't live with all of these uncertainties, if he didn't have the uncertainty of change and the uncertainty of waiting and the uncertainty of hardship, the uncertainty of sacrifice, if Abraham never had all of these things built into his life, would we be talking about him right now? I mean, would we? Absolutely not. But because he was given the opportunity to be a great man of faith and he acted in faith, showing us what it looks like, now here we are 4,000 years later talking about the man. Pretty cool. Discussion point number 6. Again, this is where you kind of do small group stuff now. It says, are you facing one of the above brands of uncertainty in your life these days? This is where you and your group can kind of talk about stuff together as a group. Hopefully by now as a small group, you've formed some pretty good relationships. Some of you have been together for a long, long time. Some of you have been together for, 6, 7, 8 months now, and some of those walls are starting to come down. This is a good chance to talk about some things you're struggling through. Maybe somebody in your group is dealing with the uncertainty of change, and they're really struggling right now. This is a chance to talk it, to bring that up and say, well, here's what we're dealing with these days. Maybe it is the uncertainty of hardship, and somebody says, "Here, this is hard on me right now, and I really don't know. I don't know how I'm supposed to deal with this." So this is a point where people talk, and as the facilitator, what you might do to really help out in this moment is if somebody voices an uncertainty that they're facing, and they're saying, "I don't know when, I don't know why, I don't know how, I don't know where," all of that. What you might do is just after they kind of bring that out, because it may be kind of an awkward moment, where you're kind of going, "Boy, that is tough, wow." What you might do as the group facilitator is just simply say to the entire group, "Hey, what would you say to him? What would you say to her?" As a group, does anybody have anything to say that might be of help? This is where the collective wisdom comes out. And this is where you encourage one another. This is where you edify one another and spur one another on toward faith. All right, so discussion point number 6 is where people have a chance to talk about what's going on and maybe some of the questions they have and struggles, or some of the successes that they're seeing in faith. Then finally, if you have time for it, discussion point number 7, it directs you to the memory verse, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14, which says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who's gone through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess." And the final question there, it says, drawing strictly from the words in this verse, what is the key to walking in faith even in the midst of doubt and uncertainty? And the key, as you look at this verse, it points us to Jesus, our great high priest, the one who's gone through the heavens. So the key to walking by faith is Jesus. Focusing on Jesus, interacting with Jesus, relationship with Jesus. Jesus must be both our example and also our prize. So it's all about that. We have to keep our focus on Him, keep our relationship with Him strong. So that's your small group lesson. It's all about faith. It's all about walking by faith and being reminded of one who's gone before us, who walked by faith, and being encouraged in that so that we can walk by faith as well. All right? Hey, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening in. I hope that your small group goes well. I'm sure it will. We'll see you Sunday.